In this video, we're going to be installing a hub and bearing in this 2007 Mazda CX-9. We're going to start by removing our wheel. It's going to be a 21 millimeter. Go ahead and take off the lug nuts now. And remove our wheel. Okay, so we're going to find our way back here to our caliper bolts. There's going to be two of them, one on the top, one on the bottom. They're going to be 17 millimeters. We'll take those out. Now once you remove this top caliper bolt, your caliper will be free. You see we have a hanger handy. We will be taking this caliper and hanging it up probably on our coil spring. We're going to hang it in a way that's not putting any stress on our brake line. Here's your last bolt. And we can slide our caliper off of the pads. And we're going to rotate it. Put our hanger on and hang it on our coil spring. Okay, so now with our caliper removed, you can see that our boot here is actually pretty damaged. You would want to replace this. The top one also fell off. Somebody's been in here before, but we're not going to focus on this. We're going to continue along. We're going to remove our brake pads. Just pull them right out. Set them aside. And now we're going to take out our two caliper bracket bolts. They're going to be 19 millimeter. So for our caliper bracket, we're not going to take one bolt out completely. We're going to loosen it up and we're going to move right on to the other bolt. We'll loosen this one up as well. And then we can go ahead and take one completely out. And then the other. Again, once you remove this, your bracket will be free to fall to the ground, so make sure you keep one hand on it. And remove your caliper bracket. So now in this same area, just below your caliper bracket, you're going to have your ball joint for your lower control arm. There's going to be a bolt. It's going to be a pinch bolt going right through the ball joint. It's going to be a 14 millimeter on one side and a 14 millimeter nut on the other. So put a wrench in back and remove that bolt. So there's your nut from the back, and your bolt should slide right out. So now, going backwards on our control arm, we have our stabilizer link right here. It's going to be a 17 millimeter nut. Now, typically with these, you'll see there's a hex head in the center. That's going to stop the center from spinning while you loosen this nut. Now, sometimes what you can do is get on here with the socket and blast that nut off without the center spinning. And we're going to try that now. While reaching behind, there's a shoulder you can feel to see if you can feel it spinning. Sometimes you can get that to come right off without the center spinning. All right, once you have the nut removed, go ahead and push that link right out of the control arm and just swing it up and out of the way. Yeah, swing it right up and out of the way. So now the next thing we're going to do is loosen up our 2 strut bolts to the knuckle, but to do that, to get a little bit better clearance around that top bolt and not do damage to our brake line here, we're going to remove the brake line from this bracket. There's a little clip holding it in place. Just going to grab a hold of that clip and pull it to the front of the vehicle. There's your clip. With that clip removed, you can then slide your brake line right out of that bracket. All right, and if you want to, you can move your caliper even a little higher out of the way. And now we have clear access to these 2 bolts. These 2 bolts are going to be straight through. There's going to be a nut on the back side. Both sides are going to be 19 millimeter. So what we're going to do now is take off the nuts and loosen the bolts. We're not going to remove the bolts. So now looking at our rotor, we have 2 Phillips screws holding our rotor nice and tight to the hub. We're going to remove those. And now we can remove our rotor. And now we're going to take off our spindle nut here. It's going to be a 34 millimeter. Now you'll notice that this spindle nut doesn't have any staking into the axle. Yours might have that. You might have to open that up so that you can take the nut off. So there's our axle nut. So now on the back side we have our tie rod and a little cotter pin here. We're going to need to remove the cotter pin. Typically cotter pins are one-time use only. So if you take this out, be prepared to replace it with a new one. And now we have the castle nut for our tie rod. That's going to be an 18 millimeter. Now we're going to take this castle nut almost all the way off. Leave it right about there. So we're going to leave our castle nut right about here. We're going to take a small to medium hammer and we're going to hit our knuckle right here to try and separate the ball joint in our tie rod end. What we're looking for is the tie rod end to drop down. The castle nut is there to stop it from dropping all the way out. We can now take that castle nut right off and lower our tie rod end out and out of the way. So now we have our speed sensor. It's going to be a 10 millimeter bolt. We'll take out that bolt now. And then we can grab a hold of our speed sensor and lift it right out. And we can set this up and out of our way. So now with everything removed from our knuckle, we're going to take our lower control arm with a pry bar and push the control arm downwards, taking our ball joint out of the knuckle. So we're going to come in across the control arm to just above where the control arm mounts. We're going to push straight down. So now that we have our control arm free, our knuckle is free to swing in and out a little bit, what we're going to do is take the knuckle and pull it forward while pushing our axle back through the hub, through the knuckle. We're going to pull our knuckle forward and remove our axle from the hub. Okay, so now with our axle out, we're going to put our knuckle back onto the control arm, which means that we're going to pry down our control arm and fit the ball joint back in place. And the reason we're doing that is we're actually going to press the hub and bearing out on the vehicle. You can take your hub and knuckle completely out and press your bearing and hub out on a press, but we're going to do it in the vehicle. So right now we have our axle out of the way, we have access to the back, we have our two top bolts loose in case we need to get a little bit more play forward or backwards. So now we're ready to set up our press. Okay, so there's our hub and part of the bearing, which is why you want to replace your bearing at the same time. Okay, so right here we have a snap ring holding in our bearing. Here, so here's the edge of the snap ring. We're going to try and use our pliers here to see if we can close that up and remove that. Doesn't look like it's going to move for us, but it's worth a try. Nope. So what we're going to do now is see if we can break that snap ring free from being rusted and corroded in there. So I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver and a small hammer, see if we can work that snap ring out. Okay, most of the way there. And now we'll see if we can pop that the rest of the way out. There's your snap ring. We will be reusing this, but before we reuse it, we'll clean up this entire ring on the wire wheel to make sure we get rid of any of the rust and corrosion, as well as the lip in here with a wire brush to make sure that this ring goes in nice and smooth. So now what we have is our knuckle held onto our strut by these two top bolts. So one of them looks like it's going to come right out. Here's your top bolt. Now the only thing holding our knuckle in place is this bottom bolt. So we're going to work this bottom bolt out while holding our knuckle. So when that bottom bolt comes out, you are in full control of that knuckle from hitting the ground. So go ahead and take that bolt out. And remove your knuckle. There's our bearing removed. So now before we press in our new bearing, we're going to take a wire brush and clean as much as we can where our snap ring goes and where the bearing sits into. There's your new bearing installed, and just enough clearance for that snap ring to go back in. So now that we have our bearing in and our snap ring clean, we have a pair of snap ring pliers on it. We're going to see if we can get our snap ring back in place. Okay. Now even though it looks like it's in, you want to take a hammer and a flat blade screwdriver or a small flat punch. You want to knock this snap ring down. Now sometimes what I like to do is come in this way and just open up that snap ring a little bit more, or see if you can get it to spin just a little bit. And that's it. Now we're ready to press in our hub. Okay, so now that we have our hub installed, we're going to install a knuckle right onto our ball joint. And while we have this amount of play here, we're going to take our axle and direct it right into the hub. Okay. Now you know if you have your splines lined up, if when you go to push backwards into the strut, that you can't get enough movement backwards. All right, so we're kind of locked up here. So we'll try and turn this axle and the hub at the same time to line those splines. There we go. And now we can get our 2 top strut bolts in place. All right, there's our 2 top strut bolts and our axle into place. What we can do now is take the 2 nuts, thread them on. Now we can take our sway bar link, put that back into the control arm. We can put our sway bar link nut back on. And we're just putting everything together finger tight. We'll be torquing everything down here under load. And now our tie rod. Right back into the knuckle. And our castle nut. And now we can put our speed sensor back in. And our 10mm bolt. And the 10mm bolt, just tighten that down. So now we're going to torque down all of our suspension bolts here. But before we do that, we need to put our vehicle under load. So for us, we're going to use a pole jack because we are on a 2-post lift. If you're at home, this is where you could use a floor jack. So we're going to center it under our control arm, and we're going to raise our front suspension on this side. This will mimic the vehicle being on the suspension with the weight of the vehicle. Now with our suspension under load, we're going to put our ball joint pinch bolt through and our nut on the other side. So now with a wrench on the back side, we're going to torque this bolt to 38 foot-pounds. And now our link bolt on the bottom, we're going to torque this down to 35 foot-pounds. Now remember again, if the center spins here while you're twisting and tightening, you're going to need to lock down the center with a hex bit. And how we'll know if it's happening is right around the back here on the other side of this bracket. We're going to feel for the shoulder to see if that's spinning. If it's not spinning, then we're good to continue. I'm going to torque it down to 35 foot-pounds. Now if we move up from our link, we have our 2 strut bolts. These are going to be 19 millimeters on both sides. We're going to torque these down to 130 foot-pounds. So now our tie rod, castle nut, is going to be torqued down to 38 foot-pounds. Now you need to align the hole in the center with the cutout on your castle nut. If at 38 foot-pounds you do not get that hole to line up, do not loosen to get the hole to line up, but continue to tighten until you get that hole to line up for your new cotter pin. So now to see if we're lined up, perfect. We'll put our new cotter pin through, and we'll come back with a pair of pliers, and we'll bend these over. Now that we're done tightening our suspension components under load, we can remove our pole jack. So now we're going to put our axle nut onto our axle end. Before we do that, we're going to put just a little bit of oil around the inside here where it mates up to the hub. And we're going to thread this on. And we're going to just come in and snug this up. And now what we'll need to do, because if we tried to torque this down while it's in mid-air, this would spin. So for us, we'll lower the vehicle, put a pry bar between the lugs, and then we'll torque this axle nut down. So now with our vehicle lowered close to the ground, we're going to torque down our spindle nut. We're going to use a pry bar between 2 of the lugs and the ground to stop our hub from spinning. We're going to torque down that spindle nut to 202 foot-pounds. Now for us, we don't have anywhere to stake down the spindle nut into the axle itself. If you did have an area to stake down your axle nut, you would want to do that now. Once you did that, we're all set to move on. So now we're ready to put our rotor back on, but because we've swapped out our hub, this surface is extremely free of corrosion, but you can see we do have some greases here and some oils. We're going to clean that with some brake clean. Now because our hub is new but our rotor isn't, we're going to take our rotor, put it on backwards. If you want to, you can put a lug nut here just for safety. And we're going to clean the back of our rotor now with some brake clean. Again, to remove the greases and oils. Once we're done with the back of our rotor, we're going to take it off, set it aside somewhere clean, and we're going to put some anti-seize on the surface of our new hub. This will help protect against corrosion. And once that's dried up, we'll put our rotor in place, lining up our Phillips holes, and then we'll put our 2 Phillips screws back in. So now we'll install our Phillips screws. Now with our Phillips screws holding our rotor nice and tight for us, we can come in on the front and clean off with some brake clean the oils and greases on the front. Once we have the surface of our rotor cleaned, our Phillips screws back in, we can now start to rebuild our caliper bracket. And now we can install our caliper bracket. We'll slide it into position and put in our 2 bolts. So we're going to torque these down to 85 foot-pounds. So now what we're going to do is install our brake pads. We have our inside pad with our wear indicator at the bottom. And squeeze that in tight to the rotor. Do the same on the front. Give them a good squeeze. Now we can take our caliper off of our hanger and slide it right over our pads. Now your pistons in the caliper should be opened up enough to slide over your pads. If for some reason the piston is closed in a little bit or you've replaced your pads, go ahead and press your pistons back to slide them over your pads. Now from here, put our caliper bolts back in. Now again, this, you can see we have some rubber boot here missing. This isn't ideal. If you had this going on, you would definitely want to replace your rubber boots in your caliper or your caliper bracket. And now we're going to torque down our caliper bolts to 65 foot-pounds. So now that our caliper is installed, we're going to put our brake hose back into the bracket here on our strut. So the hose is going to go through the bracket first. We're going to push the hose in this union or this joint here forward. Now you may have to rotate it to get it to line up and push all the way through like that. Once you get to this point here where this little slot is on the front side of this bracket, we can take our clip and slide it in. Just want to make sure that that clip is all the way in. Now we can go ahead and put our wheel back on. Typically when I put a wheel back on, I will do 2 lug nuts top and bottom, and I'll rock it back and forth to try and get it as flat as I can. Sometimes they're a little difficult to get nice and flush. This helps. And then we'll put our other lug nuts back on. We're going to snug them up while we're in the air, and then we'll lower the vehicle to torque them down. So now we're down on the ground, the wheel can't rotate. We're going to torque down our lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds, and we're going to do it in a crisscross pattern. After finishing this installation, it's important to have an alignment done on your vehicle.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.